In this episode, Dr. Lauren Grawert, Chief Medical Officer at Aware Recovery Care, has a discussion with Garrett Kamps, CEO of The Small Bow, centered around the power of storytelling and hope for the future of addiction recovery. In this powerful conversation, Dr. Grawert and Garrett explore Garrett's vision for The Small Bow and the many paths to addiction recovery. Whether you're in recovery, supporting a loved one, or simply seeking a deeper understanding, this conversation offers a fresh perspective on what addiction recovery can look like today. Let's get started.
Welcome to the Well Aware podcast. I'm Dr. Lauren Grawert, Chief Medical Officer at Aware Recovery Care. And today I'm so excited to be here with Garrett Kamps, who is the CEO of The Small Bow, which combines a podcast, a newsletter, and peer support efforts to help people on their recovery addiction journeys. And today, Garrett's going to talk about his own recovery story and how he's been able to use his talents in the IT field and the tech field and the writing field to kind of combine into this awesome new experience with the Small Bow. So, Garrett, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Happy to be here. Thank you.
You know, you've had such a rich and varied career. I mean, from contributing to high-profile publications like Billboard, Huffington Post, doing content leadership with music platforms, marketing agencies, and now at The Small Bow, you're using, it seems like, combining all of those talents to funnel into a really unique, different platform for recovery. So tell us maybe just a little bit about yourself and then about The Small Bow and what that looks like.
Yeah, happy to. So about myself, yeah, like as you mentioned, I got my start as a music journalist. This was about 25 years ago. I was living in San Francisco and I wanted to be a writer and I was trying to figure out how to break into that world. And at the time, there was a pretty viable path to being a music critic. And so that's how I got my start. I wrote for local papers in San Francisco, got my first job at one of the alt weeklies in San Francisco, which alt weeklies don't really exist anymore. For that matter, music journalism doesn't exist as a field anymore. It's one of those things that sort of got eaten by the internet to a large extent. But I was fortunate to have that be my career start. From there, because I was living in San Francisco, I got recruited by one of the very first music streaming companies, a company called Rhapsody. They were creating what now has become the default way that we all consume music. Back then, we were all really confused by this concept of like renting the music because we were all used to downloading it. But so I was really fortunate to just be early in music streaming and kind of built a career there. Of course, you know, something that was happening in parallel with all that is I was struggling a lot with alcohol addiction. Being a music journalist is one of those fields that you can really camouflage your addiction because your job is to go out to concerts and hang out with people in bands. And so, all of this behavior, which I now sort of recognize as being quite addictive alcoholic behavior, was sort of camouflage. And so I was able to have both a career and a really heavy duty alcohol addiction through my 20s and through my 30s. And so I was fortunate in that I was able to kind of continue to build my career even as I struggled more and more with my addiction. But I eventually reached a point in my mid 30s to be about, my sobriety date is actually January 23rd, 2017. So that's just about 8 years ago. So I was in my middle to late 30s and was in the process of building a marketing agency focused on music and music editorial. But I was also kind of hitting rock bottom in my addiction. And so at that point, I realized I needed to do something about it. And, I had tried a bunch of different, I had experimented with going to 12-step meetings in AA a number of times, several times over the years. But something about this moment kind of, they in AA, they call it the gift of desperation. And so I really was given the gift of desperation. And so at that point, I discovered the agnostics, We Agnostics AA community. It's the secular version of AA. So was able to click with that and put together a couple of days became 30 days, 30 became 60. And so was able to stick with sobriety that way. Um, and so, that's how I originally got sober. Um, I did continue to build that company, but um, about in 2023, I was diagnosed with cancer. And so I was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And so that was an extremely, obviously, difficult experience. I spent most of that year in chemotherapy and other kinds of treatments. And so the silver lining of that experience, is I'm in remission for one, and so I made it out the other side. But the silver lining is it just kind of helped clarify some of the things I want to do with this next chapter of my life and my career. And so at that time, I reconnected with my friend AJ, who is the original founder of the Small Bow newsletter, and we got to talking about the potential for building that into a much larger company and building out the vision for that. And it came along at a great time in my life when I was looking for a new opportunity to take all these skills that I had developed in this first part of my career and throw them into something new. And obviously, as somebody in recovery, connected very deeply with what the Small Bow is all about. And so we set off on this new adventure to build this new company.
Man, well, first of all, double congratulations. In recovery and from addiction and in recovery from cancer. I feel like there's a lot of parallels there, perhaps. And you started, I believe, you had a newsletter called Healings that was like this really deep personal look at your experiences and your illness and recovery. And how did that newsletter and kind of your experience, that cathartic experience, influence or contribute to the idea for the Small Bow, or how did those two interact?
They definitely connected. So when I was about 30 days into my cancer experience, and I had just started chemotherapy, and because I've been a writer, I've always kind of considered myself a writer first and foremost, who's taken these various career detours. But about 30 days into my cancer treatment, I of course thought, well, I should write about this, and I'll do that publicly. And so I launched the Healings newsletter is kind of a personal project, just a way to share my experience of what it was like to go through cancer treatment. Um, the other part of that story is that in addition to being diagnosed with cancer in April of 2023, it was that I was diagnosed 3 weeks after my wife and I found out that she was pregnant with our first child.
Wow.
So these two things happened within a couple weeks of one another. Um, and and so just it was a real emotional earthquake. you know um and so one of the ways that I process information and think through things is by writing. They say the only way out is through. And so I just started trying to translate everything that I was feeling and going through into this newsletter, Healings. And so I started that over the summer of that year and continued writing it throughout my chemotherapy treatment, and you know wrote all about what that was like, what that was. I had discovered, you know, there wasn't, there's lots of writing about cancer, certainly there is. But I discovered that I didn't have a lot of information about like what it was like to go through chemotherapy. I was just so naive about the process. I hadn't even really connected the dots that the chemo in chemotherapy is short for chemicals. I'd always heard that word chemotherapy, and it just was this own thing that was a mystery, right? So I kind of wanted to demystify that experience. And then as I started to move through that, and after about my fourth or fifth chemotherapy, this would be about 2.5 3 months in. They did some tests. They realized it was looking really good. I was starting to feel better. I was starting to come out of the worst of the experience, in terms of having cancer and just all of the illness that goes along with that, and of course the side effects of chemotherapy, which are extremely difficult, and in my case, almost life threatening. That's a whole other story. But coming out of that, I really started to connect with how grateful I was for my recovery, because I just started to think about what this experience would have been like if I was still out using, and not only just if I was still out using, but if I hadn't developed the tools that I had developed in recovery and connected with this spiritual journey that I think, regardless of how you are pursuing recovery, I think spirituality factors in. And I know for me, it does a great deal. And so the things that I was able to, cultivate and practice over the years, thanks to my recovery, as well as getting more into my spiritual journey, really helped get me through the experience of having cancer. Um, and and so that was just kind of what was happening with healings and with my mindset. And then simultaneously, that was when AJ, who is again is the original founder of the Small Bow, and a longtime friend and colleague. We are both in media and have a lot of mutual friends. And he and I had always had this tradition where we would take one another out for sushi on our sobriety birthdays. And so we had this long-standing tradition. And so he had obviously heard about what was going on with me, and so he reached out and asked if I wanted to do an interview for the Small Bow and just talk about the experience of having cancer and as someone in recovery. And so I did that. And then a few months went by, and then that's when we got back together for one of those sushi dinners, and started talking about the Small Bow. And because I had had this experience, putting out healings, it gave me a really direct experience of what it was like to, try to publish a weekly newsletter. And the short answer there is it's quite demanding, but it's very rewarding. So I had some good firsthand experience there. And as AJ and I started talking about what the Small Bow could be, I just really felt like, between the shared vision that we had about, what the Small Bow could be and the experience I brought to it, that we could really do something special. So that's kind of how all that sort of started to connect.
Yeah, wow. And gosh, I think where the Small Bow and Aware, where we have similarities, is just um, being innovative, thinking differently. How can we help folks with addiction, maybe in non-traditional ways or ways that haven't been thought of? In our case, we go into the home, we have peer coaches, we do integrate a lot of virtual. In your case, I almost think about the Small Bow as being like a platform where it's like a mix of headspace, calm, but for people in recovery. Would you compare that similarly, or would you say it's like a headspace app plus fill in the blank?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, one of the things that AJ and I both really agree on, and it's almost amazing when you think about it, there's not really a recognized media brand around recovery. There are here and there, but there's not a big, um, you know, widely adopted, widely recognized brand in the same way that Headspace and Calm have taken this thing that used to be, pretty abstract and difficult to wrap your head around. Meditation, right? Meditation was this thing that was came over from Eastern cultures in the 50s and 60s and 70s and had all kinds of weird baggage wrapped around it. And here Headspace and Calm came along, and they kind of just demystified it, and they made it something that really was very approachable and very accessible. A lot of the misgivings that people might have had about, oh, is it tied to this or that, they just sort of really erased all that, and they made it so this thing which I happen to think is very valuable, which is meditation and mindfulness. I think that there's a lot of benefits that people can get from those practices, but it's not always that approachable. And so you have these apps, that, in the case of Headspace, it was founded by a practicing monk. It wasn't like these were a bunch of people that decide, oh, meditation is popular and let's take advantage of that. It was actually the core of Headspace was, this guy Andy, who was a practicing monk and wanted to just bring meditation to more people. But they acknowledged that, well, we need to make this accessible. We need to make this something that the everyday person can wrap their head around. And that's how we think about the Small Bow. We talk about the Small Bow as recovery for everyone, because although AJ and I are both in recovery and we've both gotten sober through kind of traditional 12-step programs and have a great affection and appreciation for that, we recognize that that's not necessarily what everybody's going to connect to, or that might not work for everybody. And in fact, we actually see addiction as something that, and recovery as something that is not just for people who might be addicted to substances, which is obviously very common and applies in my case and in AJ's case, but you can recover from all kinds of things. The conversation, especially now, is we're talking about burnout and workaholism and phone addiction and porn addiction and gambling addiction. There's this whole spectrum of things that are now you're seeing all kinds of conversations and coverage about, but there's not really a space where people can get information about that and talk about it and connect with people and read and listen and watch things about that. And so that's what we want to build with the small bow. Something very analogous to what Headspace did for meditation, we want to do for recovery.
I love that, and I think you are so right in the sense that somebody said a couple of days ago. I heard, maybe, I think it was on Instagram. Maybe somebody said everybody is in recovery from something, or everybody is recovering from something, and
Yes.
the pathways of addiction with the dopamine spikes is really the same as in food addiction, porn addiction, gambling addiction, device addiction. Huge
Yes.
topic these days, and so I love the idea of taking those recurrence prevention skills and resiliency tips, and like letting the broader society know, hey, these can be useful in whatever your struggle is. And let's be honest, everybody's got a struggle. If you don't think you have a struggle, you're not being honest with yourself. So
Exactly.
I love that you're making it so so broad, similarly to the Headspace guy. And Headspace, I gotta say, I love their voices. I mean, whoever they found with those calm voices that has a little bit of a European accent to it. I mean,
Yeah.
it's that's the
Yeah.
magic there.
I'll tell you something, we talk about in terms of making this accessible. One of the things we always think about is, there you can see all types of content when an actor gets a Marvel role and they get really super, ripped, right? You always see all this content about their like, what did they eat, right? What did they do to get so ripped, right? What was their routine, right? That should exist for recovery, right? We should have that same conversation. And there are plenty of celebrities who are very public about their sobriety or what they've been going through in terms of managing their mental health or their recovery. We have a vision to create the same type of content you would see about, how did Jake Gyllenhaal get so ripped for Roadhouse? Okay, well, how do they manage their sobriety during the LA fires? Right? Like,
Yeah.
that's content I want to see in the world. And that's what we really imagine creating. And just in terms of making this conversation, really broadening this conversation and making it accessible to a much larger audience.
Yes. What would you tell? I think addiction is so complex, and it can look so different from person to person. And I think thus the need for a diversity of paths to recovery. What would you say, kind of in your both your own personal experience reflecting and both at the app? What is the importance of having multiple different paths to the Emerald City, let's say, of recovery, and how
Yeah.
small book kind of accomplish that?
Yeah. So in terms of my personal story, I mentioned when I was really struggling with alcoholism, I went to AA meetings, and a lot of people do this where you try a lot of different things and you kind of say, oh, that's not really for me, or that doesn't click. And partly that's just your personal preference, but also it's kind of can be your addiction, saying like, well, I'm not ready to quit. And what really clicked for me is, as I mentioned, when I found the secular recovery community in San Francisco. And what was so mind blowing to me when I walked into one of these rooms, I wasn't even seeking it out. I just I had that gift of desperation, and I was just like, well, what's the next meeting I can go to on Saturday morning? And so I just walked into this meeting. I'd probably gone to at least a dozen, maybe 2 dozen AA meetings before that over the last 15 years, and it never clicked. But I walked into this meeting, and I had the most, it was so simple, but when they read the 12 steps out loud, instead of reading the conventional 12 steps that you find in the AA Big Book, they had an agnostics versions of the 12 steps. And just that simple act of saying, let's just tweak these a little bit. Let's take the word God out and let's replace it with, the group, and just make these little changes. And the light bulb that went off for me is like, oh yeah, like you can customize this stuff. You can make it your own. You don't have to necessarily just accept someone else's dogma and say it's either this or nothing. There can be my one critique of what you encounter sometimes in very traditional AA contexts is there can be a kind of all or nothing feel to it when that's just not how a lot of people live their lives, let alone approach recovery. There has to be a lot of gray area, a lot of room to, and I don't want to be too critical because, like I said, I got sober following the AA program and have a lot of affection for it. But it was just that light bulb moment of realizing, you know what, like this stuff is fluid, it's flexible, everybody's bringing their own experience to it, and by creating a space that can be more accommodating and more open, it just becomes more inviting.
Mm,
And that's the thing that we are really focused on creating with the small bow is it's AJ said this just yesterday, and I love it. If you're at the small bow, if you're subscribed to our newsletter, if you join one of our online meetings, you belong. Like if whatever brought you there, like you are where you're meant to be. It's not, it's not something where like you have to do X, Y, and Z, or you have to have had this set of experiences in order to fit in. And one of the quotes that I love from one of our online meetings that I heard, somebody said, I'm not here to stop drinking. I just want to hate myself less, which
mm,
that was like, that's perfectly fine, and so
yeah.
many people can relate to that, and whether that leads to a kind of a softening and a receptivity to changing your habits, or whether that's, just you get something of value out of being with people who are vulnerable and sharing is totally fine. And so I think creating that space where people can feel welcome regardless of what their experience is just so important, because that's what allowed me to actually pursue recovery and get sober, and have one day lead to two, lead to 30, was finding a community that just kind of was very flexible and receptive and welcoming. And so we're trying to create something similar here.
I love that. We need so many more spaces like that. As we're starting to wrap up here, I always love ending on positive notes, and certainly there's a lot of people struggle with dark times and addiction. I can't imagine struggling with cancer, with a pregnant wife. When you think about hope for the future, what gives you the most hope about the future of addiction recovery right now? What's the bright things you would tell people to look forward to?
I think it's conversations like this. I mean, I think you know, as somebody, like I mentioned, I've been sober for just over 8 years, and so it's long enough to see a huge evolution in the way that we talk about sobriety and recovery. I remember, you know, especially when I was struggling with alcoholism, it felt like there was a lot of stigma around it. I mean, it's right there in the name, Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Like, and anonymity is obviously very important to make people comfortable. But I think part of why, anonymous was in the name originally is because there was so much stigma around addiction, and that is really just evaporating before our eyes, right? People are talking about it, they're talking about their experiences with it, and that is a really great thing to see, both, you know traditional kind of public figures, but really even just people on social media. I mean, I can open up Instagram and I can see people just talking about, getting 30 days sober or 6 months sober, or just talking about recovery and sobriety, or just their own struggles with mental health in a way that didn't seem like it was possible 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 30 years ago. So I think that we've come a long way there. And I just think that that's going to open up so much possibility, now that we're all kind of talking about this and being more open about it.
Yeah, and having folks like you who are doing these amazing projects like the small bow. I mean, every little bit helps. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I always like to ask at the end, do you have any final thoughts to share before we wrap up that we didn't cover? It's my psychiatrist open-ended question. Anything
Yeah.
else final to leave with folks, or you'd want somebody to know out there listening?
Well, I guess I will, I'll kind of take my hat off to what Aware is doing. I know, the service y'all are providing and is so valuable. And when I learned about it, I just thought, man, what a great idea. I know that when I was getting sober, I wish I had, known about something like Aware, because it would have been so helpful for me. I kind of was, I'm sure, in a situation a lot of people find themselves in, where I was trying to build a business and I was trying to, be in a relationship, and the thought of going to rehab just seemed out of reach. And so something that, like the services that Aware is providing would have been perfect, kind of to help me through the medical part of it, as well as, get me on a good track. So I guess one parting thought is just to tip my hat to what you guys are doing, because I think it's a great service.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And thank you for joining us on the Well Aware podcast. To learn more about the Small Bow, visit their website or check out the Small Bow podcast, available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. They also have a great Substack. And remember, if you or someone you know is struggling with addiction, healing is possible, hope is possible. We've got a great living example here today with us, and we just thank you for listening and thank you for the honor of your time, and we will see you next time. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you so much, Lauren.